pistachios are a relative newcomer to the California agricultural landscape, with the first commercial harvest reported in 1976. From the humble harvest that year of 1.5 million pounds to more than 1 billion pounds annually in 2021, pistachio growers have capitalized on the fertile land of the Central Valley while applying advanced practices that led to these amazing production gains. When trees in a well-managed orchard receive optimal amounts of water and nutrients and protection against pests, each tree will respond with bountiful harvests.
Is there a right way to grow these pistachios to achieve these consistent, bountiful harvests? Top agronomists in both private industry and universities are saying yes, especially when it comes to managing the very important nutrient, nitrogen. Of course, proper pistachio tree nutrition is complex and involves more than just nitrogen fertilization. Other nutrients, including potassium and boron, are also essential and are often applied in high-yield producing pistachio orchards, though there are areas in the state where naturally occurring boron is in excess of plant needs.
Lately, there has been a lot of attention paid to nitrogen and nitrate, the form that can leach into groundwater. Many groundwater basins in the Central Valley are contaminated with nitrate at levels exceeding safe drinking water standards. The State Water Resources Control Board responded by adopting the nitrate control program that is impacting every industry in California where nitrogen is used as an input or waste discharges contain nitrate.
Testing of groundwater basins in the Central Valley is finding that some portion of the contamination is attributable to applications to irrigated cropland of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, compost, and animal manures. Other nitrate sources are also contributing to groundwater contamination: livestock, wastewater treatment plants for cities, and food processing plants. Agronomists and researchers have devised a management approach for optimizing applications of nitrogen to crops to minimize leaching of excess nitrate while optimizing crop production. The approach is called the 4 R's: the right rate, right time, right place, and right source. For pistachios, the University of California, with support from the California Department of Food and Agriculture and the California Pistachio Research Board, has spent years refining the 4 R's and now has many proven practices ready to be used today in California pistachios.
Before going into details on the 4 R's, it's important to understand the relationship between soils, nitrogen fertilization, and irrigation practices. In particular, how nitrate moves in the soil and how it is taken up by a tree, essentially how all the science turns into management implications and tools. A fundamental point to remember, in a pistachio orchard, any source of nitrogen applied as a nutrient to a crop can convert to nitrate. If conditions are right, nitrate can eventually leach beyond the root zone and into underground aquifers. Other factors are in play with nitrate, such as soil mineralization, losses to the atmosphere, and biological processes. But leaching excess nitrate to groundwater is a major focus these days and deserves much attention.
Excess nitrate is defined as fertilizer applied that is not taken up by the tree during the active growing season. First, we have to understand why nitrogen is important for plants.
Plants use more nitrogen than any other nutrient. For pistachios in an on year, 80% of nitrogen goes into proteins used for the developing nuts. In an off year, nitrogen demand will be lower, more on that later. Nitrogen is used in the tree's DNA and in hormones that signal the plant to perform certain functions such as cell division. Nitrogen is also a component of amino acids, which are used by the tree to make enzymes, which are also important for cell functions. Nitrogen is also critical for chloroplasts, which are the tree's sugar-making factories. When nitrogen is deficient in the tree, it can limit growth and cause leaf chlorosis. However, it's rare to see a nitrogen deficiency. More often, we see high nitrogen levels, which can cause excessive vegetative growth, especially in young trees. When thinking about nitrogen applications, you want to think about providing just enough to either meet your yield demand in mature trees, or in young trees, you want to get good growth, but not the extra vigorous growth.
It's important to understand that trees take up nitrogen when they demand it. So, in mature trees with a good crop set, the vast majority of nitrogen goes into the crop and a small amount supplies the vegetative growth. When planting a new orchard, especially in rich soils, it's important to perform a soil test to ensure that the correct amount is available to the new trees. Under these conditions, additional nitrogen applications may not be needed until the tree starts showing significant growth.
Keep in mind that too much nitrogen in young orchards can possibly delay transition into dormancy, which could leave a tree vulnerable to winter kill or frost damage. However, this connection has not been fully determined. Excess nitrogen fertilization can also lead to increased disease susceptibilities, so a key component of the 4 Rs is the right amount of nitrogen. Research has shown that on average, an orchard needs about 28 pounds of nitrogen per acre for every 1,000 pounds of marketable yield, and about 20 to 30 pounds to account for any vegetative growth. Pistachios might need a bit more nitrogen in years 5 through 8 as the tree is still actively filling its space, while also accounting for the nut load of these trees.
Researchers came up with these numbers by analyzing the nitrogen content in the nuts and shells and by measuring the amount of nitrogen in the tree structure itself. The tree takes up nitrogen throughout the growing season, starting at leaf out and continuing up to harvest. Currently, we have no evidence that pistachios take up nitrogen after harvest. We want the right amount in the tree, when the tree needs it, and where it can get it.
To help understand how to effectively manage nitrogen applications, you need to make sure you understand the different forms of nitrogen in the soil and how nitrogen is taken up by the tree. There are basically 3 forms of nitrogen in the soil: soil organic matter, ammonium, and nitrate. Soil organic matter is the nutrient storage bank in your soil. In the short term, organic matter nitrogen is tied up in big, complex organic molecules that are not immediately available to plants. But over time, this organic matter breaks down and provides a steady supply of ammonium and nitrate to the soil and roots. Plants can take up some of these amino acids directly, but these tend to be short-lived in the soil, especially in the warm, irrigated soils we have here in the Central Valley. Ammonium and nitrate are the forms of nitrogen that roots can take up.
Being positively charged, ammonium can stick to soil particles, which are predominantly negatively charged and hence does not leach easily. Nitrate is the other form of nitrogen that roots can take up from the soil. However, nitrate is negatively charged, so it cannot stick to soil particles, making it susceptible to leaching. As a reminder, when we talk about cation exchange capacity in soils, we mean the ability of a soil to temporarily hold on to positively charged molecules. Ammonium is one of those positively charged molecules typically found in the soil.
How do these forms of nitrogen cycle through different forms in the soil? Let's start with soil organic matter. As organic matter is broken down by soil microbes, it releases ammonium. In warm, moist soils, this can occur in a matter of weeks to months, while in cold soils, below 55 degrees Fahrenheit, this can be a very slow process. The carbon to nitrogen ratio is also critical. The higher the ratio, the slower the breakdown. Because this process is driven by microbial activity in the soil, it's very complex. As with all biological processes, it happens faster when moisture is present, when there is oxygen for microbes to use, and when temperatures are warmer, and when organic matter has a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio.
When you apply organic amendments such as compost, you stimulate microbial activity, and those microbes require nitrogen and carbohydrates, both of which are present in compost. A good rule of thumb is that if the compost is less than 2% nitrogen, any nitrogen is going to be tied up by those microbes for a period of time until those microbes die. So in organic systems, or if compost is applied as a supplement to conventional fertilizer, it's important to understand the nitrogen content of the compost, since its availability to the plant can be delayed until the compost breaks down.
Once nitrogen is in the ammonium form, it can then turn into nitrate through a process called nitrification. Nitrification is also microbe-driven, so the rate at which this occurs depends primarily on temperature. In California soils, during the growing season, nitrification happens in a matter of days to weeks. As a consequence of this rapid microbial action, the nitrogen in soil organic matter converts to ammonium, which turns into nitrate and is leachable if it is not taken up by the tree. Same goes for fertilizer urea. It quickly converts to ammonium, then nitrate, which can leach if it's not taken up by the tree.
So how fast does nitrogen in organic matter and ammonium nitrogen turn into nitrate? At 50 degrees Fahrenheit, it takes 4 weeks for 40% of the ammonium present to convert into nitrate. At around 60 degrees in the top 2 to 3 inches of soil, 60% of ammonium that you apply will turn into nitrate in 2 weeks if it's not taken up by the plants. At 75 degrees, it only takes 2 weeks for 100% of the ammonium to turn into nitrate.
Now let's talk about how nitrogen moves in the trees. Nitrogen uptake in trees is regulated by a number of biological factors. One principle to understand is that the trees will limit nitrogen uptake when the plant already has all the nitrogen it needs. You can over-apply beyond what is needed, and there are maybe some uptake, but there is a point of diminishing return since not all applied will be taken up by the roots. If a tree does have a need for nitrogen, the uptake rate may increase as the applied rate increases, but the tree will eventually reach a plateau and uptake maxes out. It gets to a bottleneck stage where you just can't get more nitrogen into the tree. It's already going as fast as it can.
Translated to a management practice, this means spoon feeding or applying smaller amounts over multiple applications. The more split applications, the better. You have less nitrogen sitting in the soil, waiting to be taken up by the tree, and vulnerable to leaching due to an accidental over-irrigation or poor distribution uniformity, leaching nitrates from portions of the field. Which all means that more nitrogen applied does not necessarily mean more nitrogen is taken up, and it won't increase yields, especially if a tree was already at sufficiency levels.
All of this science about how nitrogen behaves in the soil and in trees has to be translated into practices for managing a pistachio orchard. Let's start with the right rate. Applying the right rate is about matching nitrogen supply with the nitrogen tree demand. That demand is all the nutrients a tree needs to build the nut meats, hulls, shells, roots, branches, twigs, and leaves. This is our supply side. Cover crops, manure, compost, the nitrate in irrigation water and synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, and even what is already in the tree, especially if there's a history of heavy applications in the past.
Before we go on, let's talk a minute about nitrate in irrigation well water, or as it's being called, pump and fertilize. Years of research has shown that this nitrate is available for plants to absorb and use just like any other source of nitrogen. An inexpensive well test can tell you exactly how much nitrate is in your irrigation water. Here's how to do the math. Take the test results, say 35 parts per million, and multiply it by 0.225. That equals 7.875 pounds of nitrogen per acre inch of water. If you apply 36 acre inches or 3 acre feet of water during the growing season, the total is 283.5 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. There is one more step. You need to multiply that 283 pounds times the crop nitrogen use efficiency. As a rough estimate, let's use 70% efficiency. At 35 parts per million and 70% efficiency, you should include about 198 pounds of nitrogen per acre in your overall nitrogen budget just from your irrigation water. Think of it this way. That's 198 pounds of free nitrogen applied to your crop. Better yet, you're helping to clean up the groundwater aquifer. Some of the nitrogen that isn't used by the tree can cycle in the soil, but generally any excess nitrate is susceptible to leaching into groundwater.
Keep in mind that a pistachio tree is regulating its nitrogen uptake since there is an energy cost to the tree to take up nitrogen. If we apply more than a tree needs, it's not going to expend extra energy to take up or incorporate nitrogen that it doesn't need. If we apply too much in a season, or even more than a tree can take up at a time, this can mean that we are spending money we don't need to spend on something the tree has no use for.
So how do we arrive at the right rate? In 2012, a 3-year research project was funded by the California Pistachio Research Board to study orchards in the North, Central, and South Central Valley. The fieldwork was done in Kerman. Analyses were taken of those orchards throughout the growing season, monthly samples of nutrient content of the leaves, fruit, trunk, and scaffolds and roots. Samples were taken from 10 trees at each site over 3 years. When averaged over all 6 sites over 3 years, the result was 28 pounds of nitrogen removed in every 1,000 pounds of marketable yield. So our right rate is about 28 pounds per 1,000 pounds of marketable yield. For a mature orchard, add another 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre for tree growth. A fully mature tree with good yield demands about 20 pounds, while an actively growing tree with little yield might demand 30 pounds. One complication is that pistachios do alternate bear, so you need to match the nitrogen application to your expected yield in an on or off year.
Now let's talk about the right time. Keep in mind that a tree has biological bottlenecks called transporters that control nitrogen uptake into the roots, preventing uptake if there is no tree demand. Applying at the right time is about matching the timing of the tree demand with root uptake. When we look at the growing season between leaf out and harvest, April, May, June, July, and August, it gives us an idea of how much nitrogen will eventually become 1,000 pounds of marketable yield.
What our studies found was nitrogen uptake can differ if a tree is in an on or off year. In an on year, uptake is heavier during nut fill, and in an off year, uptake is heavier early in the season, and the overall uptake rate is lower. One caveat is that this research was done on Kerman pistachios on Pistachio atlantica rootstock, which alternate bear more heavily. These days, pistachios are planted on UCB1 rootstock, which alternate bears less severely, and Golden Hills and Lost Hills alternate bear less than Kerman. Here are current recommendations. In an off year, apply 50% of the nitrogen before shell hardening. In an on year, apply nitrogen more evenly from leaf out to harvest. When is it too early to begin applying nitrogen? Several studies have shown that root growth probably begins in April. We also know that nitrogen used by the trees when growth starts pushing all comes from the storage in the tree structure. So it's not worth applying nitrogen before leaf out because roots are not taking up nitrogen yet, leaving it to be potentially leached by rain or irrigation. The same can be said for applying nitrogen in September or later when uptake diminishes to essentially zero.
One of the best tools to guide your decisions on the right amount and right time is through leaf analysis. Leaf sampling results can provide valuable information to help you design a rational, plant-based fertilization regime. Pistachio growers have been using leaf analysis for more than 20 years to check tree nitrogen status, typically pulling leaves in July. For most varieties, that's usually too late to make any substantial adjustments in nitrogen applications before the crop matures.
The University of California recently completed supporting research for leaf samples taken in May. Having the results early enables growers to react quickly by either holding off on additional applications if nitrogen levels are adequate or adding fertilizer if a deficiency is apparent. This leaf sampling in May will allow you to predict with a good degree of accuracy what your nitrogen levels will be in July. You can store this information in CropManage, an interactive website developed by the University of California, where your lab results can be compared to appropriate ranges. On CropManage, search for the Pistachio Early Leaf Sampling Protocol, which will allow you to find a downloadable, editable spreadsheet.
The May leaf sampling can be easily done following a few simple steps. Once the foliage has developed, usually between 30 to 45 days after full bloom, find a healthy shoot that does not have any nutlets. That piece is called a non-fruiting shoot. Find a leaf that is in the sunlight at least part of the day. Collect the subterminal leaflets. Those are the leaflets that are just behind the big leaflet at the end of a leaf. When collecting the leaf samples, think of your tree as a pie split into 4 quarters. Collect 1 terminal leaf per quarter for a total of 4 subterminal leaflets per tree. Select trees that are at least 30 yards apart, from a minimum of 18 trees per orchard block if soils and tree growth are fairly uniform. If there are dramatically different soil types, subdivide the orchard into blocks based on the soil type and take leaf samples from each area. Put all of your leaflets from each orchard block into separate paper bags. Mix them well, label the bag with an orchard identification, and send them to your nutrient analysis lab of choice as quickly as possible. If temperatures are warm, keep the leaf samples in an ice chest.
It's best to get a full leaf tissue analysis, not just nitrogen. Instruct the lab to analyze for nitrogen and also the other key elements of phosphorus and potassium. Results from all these nutrients in combination will better guide recommendations if changes in applications are needed. Once you receive the leaf sample results, the nitrogen values can be input into CropManage. Also include results for other nutrients into your CropManage worksheet. If using July samples, remember that while pistachio trees generally respond with more crop and vigor when more nitrogen is applied until about 2.3% leaf nitrogen, beyond 2.3% we don't see much value. There aren't increased yields beyond that level, nor is there increased tree health. In fact, beyond 2.7%, there are negative impacts such as too much vegetative growth. The ideal range is between 2.2 and 2.5% leaf nitrogen. Leaf sampling results can help you fine-tune your yield-based nitrogen management strategy to better match your crop yields to your yield estimates.
So where is the right place to apply nitrogen fertilizers? Applying in the right place means knowing where the majority of roots are and applying nitrogen where roots can best take up any nutrients and water as well. Typically, the vast majority of important feeder roots are in the top 3 feet of soil. Pistachios can actually send roots several meters deep to take up water, but it's uncertain whether those roots can take up nitrogen. Roots will be shallower in young trees, of course, and root depth will change as the tree grows. So it's in that upper zone where you want to keep your water and nutrient applications. And remember, nitrate moves with water, so if you push water below the root zone, you risk pushing nutrients below the root zone also. Active roots will always be in the same location that irrigation water is applied. In old flood irrigated orchards, roots probably look like what you think of when you think of a tree root system, spread out and exploring a very large area. Root distribution in an orchard can vary dramatically if you compare tree-to-tree sprinklers and flood irrigation to high-efficiency systems, such as micro-sprinklers or double-line drip. However, it's important to remember that they will be concentrated where the water is applied. That is why fertigation, injecting fertilizer during irrigations, is the most efficient method when using high-efficiency systems. All of the nitrogen is applied directly to an area with a high concentration of active roots. And speaking of fertigation, always inject the fertilizer at the last half or quarter of an irrigation set. That way the fertilizer isn't pushed past the root zone. Then stop the injection 10 to 15 minutes before the set is finished to ensure the system is adequately flushed.
As for the right source of nitrogen, there is no indication that the form or type applied will impact yield or tree growth. However, the short-term leaching potential can vary. Ammonium is a positively charged form of nitrogen and will not initially leach. However, soil microorganisms rapidly convert ammonium nitrogen to nitrate nitrogen when soils are warm and moist. During the growing season, it can take only 1 week before 100% of ammonium nitrogen is converted to nitrate nitrogen, and nitrate nitrogen is leachable. Again, nitrate is negatively charged and can move through the soil very easily, so keep in mind when choosing nitrogen fertilizer and managing that fertilizer application. There is a lot that goes into selecting the right source. In particular, how much do you want to spend per acre? What application method is used, broadcast or fertigation through sprinklers or drip? There are many nitrogen fertilizer product options, but each has its own baggage.
When choosing a commercial nitrogen fertilizer, consider how much and when the nitrogen is available for plant uptake. Calcium nitrate is a readily available form of nitrogen, but also has a high leaching potential. This leaching potential can be managed with well-timed applications, and calcium nitrate is well suited to fertigation systems. The calcium and calcium nitrate can also be helpful for managing soil salinity. While pistachios are fairly tolerant of salinity, it can still negatively impact tree health. Urea ammonium nitrate, UAN, is very popular due to its solubility. The mixture of nitrogen forms makes this a slightly less leachable form of nitrogen, although in warm spring and summer conditions, the conversion to nitrate is very rapid. Additionally, urea is very leachable until it is converted into ammonium.
An additional consideration is whether these fertilizers will acidify the root zone. Ammonium and ammonium-creating fertilizers will decrease soil pH. This can be a good thing if you are growing an orchard in an area with high pH, high free lime, or sodic conditions. However, it can be a bad thing if you are growing an orchard in a light-textured soil that has a low ability to buffer pH changes. When applying compost or manure, remember these materials need time to mineralize and convert to ammonium, making it plant available. As in, it will take years. The release rate depends on how it is incorporated, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, and we suggest you look up information specific to the form you are using.
Some agronomists estimate that about 40% of N applied in compost is available in the first year after application, another 30% the following year, then the balance is released across several years. Research performed by the University of California suggests that there can be significant variability in those estimates, depending on many factors, including compost sources, temperature, soil types, and other factors. As for nitrogen content, compost averages about 3 to 4% nitrogen. So, if you apply 4 tons per acre, nitrogen available the first year would be about 96 pounds per acre. And remember, availability of the nitrogen from compost is very temperature dependent. There are lots of reasons why you are making fertilizer choices, but always keep in mind the vulnerability inherent with each choice.
Finally, let's pull together a right rate, right time, right place, and right source into one calculation.
First, you have to consider the yield history of each orchard, the current year growing conditions, conditions at bloom, and use that information to develop a realistic yield potential of, say, a 5,000-pound marketable yield crop in an on-year. The efficiency of your irrigation system, the accuracy of your calculations, and the timing and precision of your applications all influence the efficiency with which applied nitrogen can be used by the tree. Growers can be as low as 50% efficient and as high as 80% efficient. If the projected yield is 5,000 pounds of marketable yield, then multiply 5 by 28 and add 20 pounds to cover tree growth, resulting in 160 pounds of nitrogen demand. Then subtract any nitrogen that comes from your irrigation water or compost applications. Divide this amount by the nitrogen use efficiency factor of your field. In this example, assuming a 50% efficiency, the application rate would be 320 pounds of nitrogen. An 80% efficiency would require only 200 pounds of nitrogen. Low efficiency costs you real money and will leach large amounts of nitrate. It is worthwhile to optimize your application to avoid this wastage of nitrogen. That's our rate.
Then we get into the right time. We know that the growing nuts are where the vast majority of the nitrogen goes. So we're looking at even applications commencing in April through August or September, depending on the cultivar you're growing. Golden and Lost Hills are harvested a few weeks to a month before Kerman. On an on-year, apply nitrogen evenly throughout kernel development, making sure that 60% goes on during fruit growth and kernel development. On an off-year, apply most before shell hardening. If there is residual nitrogen in the soil from prior years, that should also be considered. Then we are managing our irrigation to keep most of our water in the top 3 feet.
Here is a summary of the takeaways from this session. 28 pounds of nitrogen for every 1,000 pounds of marketable yield. Change your nitrogen application strategies based on whether this is an on or off year. Focus on fruit development in an on year and before shell hardening in an off year. Don't put more nitrogen on than the plant is taking up and using.
Following these steps will go a long way toward increasing your nitrogen use efficiency and decreasing nitrate leaching to groundwater. Best of all, it ensures you get the most value from an expensive crop input. And in this farming economy, we all want the best return on every dollar invested.